Good morning from Washington, and this is Shuja Nawaz. I'm director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. We are delighted this morning to connect with Dr. Shashi Tharoor, former minister in the Indian National Congress government. He is speaking to us live from India. We also have online with us my Deputy Director Bharat Gopalaswamy, as well as our senior fellow Rajan Menon, who is speaking from his own offices in Philadelphia. I'm going to keep it very short. Just want to say that Shashi Tharoor is well known to all of us. He has been a voice for many in India, and he's been well known globally with his service at the United Nations, but more recently as a voice of the people in India, where he has just been re-elected to Parliament at a time when his party suffered a fairly massive and comprehensive defeat. But we thought it would be important now in the new political atmosphere of India to hear directly from him on not just what happened in the elections, but what's likely to happen in India and the region going forward. So I'm going to request Dr. Tharoor to speak initially, and then we'll go to comments and questions from my colleagues as well as anyone else that wishes to join us. So, Shashi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shuja, and glad to be connected to the Atlantic Council's discussion on what's happening in India. I must say that we are looking at a cataclysmic event from the point of view of my party, the Congress Party, which has lost power after 10 years heading the UPA coalition government. And at the same time, we are witnessing a new era in Indian politics with the ascension to the Prime Ministership of Narendra Modi, a figure who in many ways will be a more presidential Prime Minister than this country has seen in 3 decades, and somebody who for the first time since 1989 commands an absolute majority for his own party in the lower house of Parliament. This, by the way, is again something we've not been accustomed to in the last 3 decades, given that every government since 1989 has had to be a coalition or at least supported by other parties in the House for its survival. I will say, in talking about this government's attitude to the world, that earlier there were some grounds for disquiet on the part of some of us, and I preface my remarks by stressing that as in America, we tend to take the attitude here that political differences stop at the water's edge or at the borders of our country, and that when we speak of foreign policy, we really speak of India's foreign policy and not a party's foreign policy. Nonetheless, there were some statements during the very belligerent election campaign that Mr. Modi led that had caused some disquiet, both inside India and outside it. There were statements about Pakistan which had prompted a Pakistani minister to actually issue a statement of concern. There had been statements about illegal immigration from Bangladesh, saying that Mr. Modi declared that every Bangladeshi in India should be prepared to pack their bags and leave on the 16th of May, which had of course caused some alarm in Bangladesh. The statements during the election campaign in Tamil Nadu about Sri Lanka had raised some eyebrows and some heckles in Colombo. So there were a number of things that people were worried about. Was this going to be all this talk about robustness? Was there a danger of causing offense? Was there a danger that indeed the rhetoric would paint the BJP into a corner where the slightest provocation on the border would lead the new government to feel obliged to live up to its own professions of robustness and create an international incident that would do India great harm? So these were the kinds of worries that we all had, but I have to say that in the 2 weeks since Mr. Modi's election victory, he's reassured many of us with his statements and his actions. His statements have been accommodative, conciliatory and inclusive, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, if I can use a personal example, I was a bit taken aback to receive a congratulatory tweet from him on my own election, an invitation to work together to take India forward. I mean, for those who aren't aware of this, he and I have crossed swords rather robustly, to use the phrase, during the preceding 2.5 years. So there have been surprises like that throughout. And of course, on the international plane, the big surprise was the unprecedented invitation to heads of state and government of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation countries, 7 of them, and Mauritius, which, despite not being a member of SAARC, has a 63% Indian population. And this invitation was greeted with astonishment in many parts of the world, not least in the subcontinent itself and across the Indian polity. Of course, it was the Prime Minister's prerogative to invite whomever he wanted to, but it was an amazing gesture, which I think in the end was appreciated by all who received it, because every one of them came, including the Pakistani Prime Minister, who took the longest to make up his mind about the invitation. But they all came. The only one who couldn't make it for reasons truly beyond her control was the Bangladeshi president, who was long committed to an official visit to Japan on the very same dates. But she sent her Speaker of Parliament to represent her. The suggestion behind this is that Mr. Modi was prepared to put his rhetoric behind him. And I might add that his absolute majority is in that sense quite liberating. It liberates him both from the consequences and constraints of his own political rhetoric, and it liberates him from what previous governments in recent years have been enduring, namely the constraints of coalition rule, where allies such as the chief ministers of various states were able to have an effective veto on India's foreign policy to the countries those states were closest to or most concerned about. And indeed, the threat, the blackmail option that was available to these state governments was they could bring down the coalition in Delhi at any time on any issue that mattered enough to them. And for the first time in Indian political history, foreign policy seemed to matter enough to a couple of state chief ministers that they could actually threaten to jeopardize a central government over it. Now, Mr. Modi has no such constraints. His party has an absolute majority. In addition, he has a further cushion of a pre-election alliance, which has an even further 50, or adds a further 50-odd seats to his majority in parliament. So he's a very secure prime minister. And as he demonstrated on the invitation to Sri Lanka's President Rajapaksa, his ability to essentially cock a snook at parties whom the previous government would have needed to appease or mollify, became apparent when vociferous protests by Tamil parties were essentially quite blithely ignored, and the invitation was extended. I might add that the pattern of relationships with other countries, if I were to do a very quick tour so we have more time for a discussion with the audience. First with Pakistan, as I said, the worry was that given the tendency for incidents to occur on the border, which the Pakistani government usually claims to be beyond their control and conducted by non-state actors, the worry was that the BJP would feel imprisoned by its own rhetoric and painted into a corner would react with a robustness it always caricatured the UPA government for not possessing, and that this could create an escalation. In fact, 2 days after the election of Mr. Modi, an Indian soldier was killed on the border, and yet the BJP not only did not react with action, which was understandable since they were not yet the government, they had not yet taken office, but it did not even react with inflammatory language. And that was a very encouraging sign. The reports of the conversation with Nawaz Sharif, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, suggest that while there was some talking that kept the government within the consensual lines of Pakistan policy held by all parties in India, which is that substantive talks in each other's countries are not really possible until and unless Pakistan takes visible steps to pursue, prosecute and punish the perpetrators of the 26/11 terrorist attacks on Mumbai, and to dismantle the infrastructure from which terrorist attacks have been launched both on India on Indian soil and on Indian interests in Afghanistan. Now, that position appears to have been reiterated by Mr. Modi, but at the same time, it has been indicated that there was a great deal of willingness to talk business and trade and normal economic relations, which seems to augur well for the development of a warmer climate between the two countries. On the US, actually, before I go through a quick list of countries, let me make a general point so I don't keep repeating myself. It is clear to me that Mr. Modi's foreign policy, judging by these first couple of weeks since his result and his first 4 days in office, is likely to be marked particularly by an emphasis on economic relations, on doing business, as it were, with other countries, which is something that is characteristic of a chief minister who devoted a disproportionate amount of his energies to soliciting investment, both from abroad and from within the country. So coming back to the US, I don't believe that the visa issue, the denial of a visa to him in 2005, will be allowed to rankle. I think there will be a red carpet unfurled for visiting US businesses, and investment coming to India will certainly be welcomed by Mr. Modi and encouraged. Similarly with China, though there's been some bellicose rhetoric about incidents on the border, it must not be forgotten that Mr. Modi, as Chief Minister of Gujarat, made no fewer than 4 visits to China, and therefore it was not a surprise that the Foreign Minister of China announced a visit very quickly to India before any others have done so, and the Prime Minister of China has already had a conversation with the Prime Minister of India on his 3rd day in office. As far as Europe is concerned, the European Union ambassadors were the first to reach out to Mr. Modi amongst the entire international community, and did so quite overtly more than a year ago, and this, I think, will hold them in good stead as Mr. Modi looks to a continent with which trade already has become the most significant aspect of the relationship. With Africa, an area where Indian businesses have been active and where the Indian government has paid a great deal of post-colonial political attention, Mr. Modi is bound to pay more attention because a significant presence on the African continent is of Gujarati expatriate businessmen from Mr. Modi's home state. And it can be assumed that their interests will get a sympathetic hearing in the new Prime Minister's office. And above all, one might say, Japan will be a very important partner for India. The two Prime Ministers have a similar view of the world, including of global issues. They are interested in each other's economies, and it hasn't escaped notice that Prime Minister Abe in Tokyo only follows 3 people on the entire planet on Twitter, and one of them is Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So I think we can look for some pretty warm relationships between the new Prime Minister of India and his counterpart in Tokyo. I think all of this suggests that, as I wrote in my 2012 book, Pax Indica, that India will find itself increasingly executing a policy that moves away from some of the earlier rhetoric of both sides to a consciousness that we live in a world defined by the networked reality of the World Wide Web, that increasingly India will find itself a part of various global networks, a member of various kinds of patterns of relationships, in each of which it has a valid part. So it will be continuing to seek perhaps a permanent membership of the UN Security Council, while focusing visible attention on its own immediate neighborhood, South Asia. It will remain, for practical purposes, a member of the G20, which is, after all, managing the world's macroeconomic relationships, while at the same time at the United Nations continuing its role as a major voice of the G77, the global trade union. So both the management and the trade union, as it were, of developing countries. It will remain, at least for appearance's sake, an audible figure in the non-aligned movement, which rallies together the post-colonial developing countries in a common cause, while playing an increasingly audible role in the community of democracies, alongside the very countries it rails against in the non-aligned movement. And similarly, you'll find small relationships being given importance. You'll find India continuing to play an active role in the RIC, the Russia, India, China trilateral, which meets a foreign minister every year, foreign minister level every year, that then adds Brazil and South Africa to create BRICS, to which Mr. Modi and the government have already paid rhetorical significance in the party manifesto of the BJP. Then you will see India participating in an exercise that takes away the Russians but leaves in the Chinese and comes up with the basic formula for environmental negotiations. And then, of course, goes the other way and works without either the Russians or the Chinese in Southern Hemisphere cooperation and IPSA. And all of these alphabet soup of alliances or networks, the only country that is common to all of them is India, and not merely because our name conveniently begins with that indispensable element in every one of these acronyms, a vowel, but also because I think India has a useful contribution to make to each of these, as well as derives benefit from its membership and participation in each of these. So this is broadly the kind of situation I see. I don't expect any significant changes, perhaps an even greater emphasis on economic relations than was already the case under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, without the distractions or the constraints of alliances within India or the lack of a majority domestically. And this suggests that you will have fairly clear and confident foreign policy from this government in the months ahead. We in the opposition will be watching it closely, and of course, as I said, we don't demur with foreign policy issues when we are dealing with the outside world. But inside the country, if there are any major departures from the outlines I've suggested, we will be ready, of course, as a constructive but robust opposition to have our say as well. I'll be happy to take questions or comments. Thank you, Shuja.
Thank you very much, Shashi. Clearly, it's a question almost of plus à change, except for the fact that, as you said, the government now has a solid majority and won't be beholden to partners who may end up pushing it or blackmailing it in one direction or the other. So on the foreign policy side, there really shouldn't be that dramatic a change. The question that really comes to mind is, will he be able to transform the domestic economic situation? Will he be able to, as he promised, transform India's economy and put it back on the trajectory of growth? What is your thinking on that?
Well, this has been his entire sort of campaign motif. He's been basically arguing that he is the man who can, in Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase from '79, get India back to work. And I think his credibility would be very severely dented with the Indian public if he didn't give that his greatest attention. He has just got underway. He's only been in office since the 26th evening. So it is early days to judge. But very clearly the priorities of his government are going to be economics, are going to be increasing the growth rate and increasing employment opportunities. And many of the things that my government, the UPA government, was accused of having allowed itself to be hobbled by. For example, the concerns of environmentalists is often held up as an example of what was wrong with our governance, that too many projects by big industry were not cleared or were kept pending, while environmental considerations were thoroughly looked into. This is the kind of thing that he says his government is going to expedite, which may mean essentially to give environmental worries the go-by. That may certainly receive a sympathetic hearing in certain business quarters, but it will undoubtedly raise some worries, not just amongst environmentalists, but amongst people living in ecologically sensitive areas, tribal people whose territories are often used as examples of the kinds of things that we haven't so far allowed mining to take place in or big industry to come into. Those are some of the challenges. But very clearly the nation has given him a mandate for economic development, for pursuing shall we say, a more economics-oriented governance strategy than we were credited with having done. I mean, I can speak till I'm blue in the face about the extraordinary transformations that the UPA did bring about in its 10 years of rule, but the public has gone in a different direction, and I think we will have to see to what extent he's able to fulfill it. But the challenges are enormous, as I'm sure Mr. Modi and the BJP realize.
Thank you again, Shashi. Let me go to Bharat and see if he can join us, and then after him, Rajan, so we can carry on this conversation. Bharat, please.
I actually have some kind of question for Shashi. It is something that, yes, the nation has given him a mandate, but if you look at the percentage of votes, he's only gotten 31%, and the rest of the 69% has voted against him. You could just dig into the factors that affected the Congress party's success in this election. And the other thing is, I just feel the Congress has not articulated its success very clearly, and it has not reached the masses of their success. So I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Well, I think certainly as far as the percentage is concerned, this is a legacy of our Westminster first-past-the-post system, in which very, very few candidates actually win with a majority of the votes in their constituencies, in their districts, as the Americans would say. They win with a plurality for the most part. That is, that the average victor gets somewhere between 35 and 40% of the vote, not 51. But that's the first past the post system. When you have a multiplicity of parties, the victor rarely commands a majority. And so indeed the BJP has 31% and has 11% of the vote share more than the Congress party, which has just under 20%. But that 11% difference translates into 600% more seats, because they have 284 seats to our 44. And that is one of the oddities, if you like, of a system that obviously everyone who lives in the Anglo-Saxon world is quite familiar with, so I won't need to belabor the point. On your second issue of where the Congress failed, you said succeeded, but I think you were being diplomatic. Where the Congress failed, clearly a number of issues went against us. One element was the price rise. We were blamed for both food price inflation and fuel price inflation, and much as we could argue that most of those were caused by international factors that we had no specific control over, it was certainly held against us. A second issue was the corruption issue. Again, we would argue that no political party in India has a monopoly on either corruption or on virtue, but sadly corruption is endemic in our society. It so happened that the functioning of free democratic institutions in our country, from the independent controller and auditor general to the free press and civil society, resulted in corruption becoming a major issue of mass public attention during our time in office. Had some of the same elements, including the 370-odd all news, all the time cable television channels, all existed when the BJP was in power the last time. Their corruption scandals would have probably dwarfed ours as well. I mean, they had corruption scandals even in the middle of the fighting war, the Kargil War. But be that as it may, the corruption scandals happened on our watch, and the public certainly felt that we were tarnished by the corruption issue. A third factor was that some of these governance things we just talked about in response to Shrija's question meant that we lost the support of big business early on in UPA 2, the second administration of UPA. And once we lost big business, we lost the media, because in India, the big media is almost entirely controlled by big business. And losing them, therefore, we paid a hard price, because the media consistently kept up a hostile drumbeat against the UPA government and the Congress party. On top of all that, there certainly is grounds for arguing that some Congress representatives and elected officials lost touch with the grassroots. That this habit of going back regularly to maintain contact with party workers and voters in their constituencies week after week, month after month, that was not always practiced, and I think that disconnect became apparent when the votes were to be cast. Many of our ministers, for example, amongst the most prominent leaders, not only lost their seats, but very often didn't come second in their constituencies. They came third, or in some cases fourth, amongst the various parties contesting. That was a pretty serious repudiation of their grassroots connect. And then finally, I would argue there was an extremely effective, lavishly financed and brilliantly executed marketing campaign for brand Modi, which the Congress simply didn't even come close to matching. Every Congress candidate was outspent by 4-1 or 5-1 by the BJP. They were extremely well financed, and on top of that, their outreach both on media, on the streets, and through mass rallies, including such devices as India's first ever use of holographic rallies, where Mr. Modi would speak in one place, but 3D holograms of him would appear simultaneously in a dozen or more other locations at some horrendous cost. That kind of campaign technique the BJP was able to pull off, and certainly we witnessed one of the most impressive political marketing campaigns, arguably the most, that has ever been seen in Indian political history. So that too took its, took its toll of the Congress party, and it was a factor in explaining our defeat.
Thank you again, Shashi. Let's go to Rajan for his comment and questions.
Shashi, greetings again from New York. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you, Rajan.
So, in this country, as you no doubt know, there have been two portraits of Mr. Modi, rather Manichaean view. One is, will we see the fire-breathing RSS Hindutva man, or will we see the pragmatic administrator who brought India the Gujarat miracle? And your comments rather suggest that there will be more continuity than change, if I understood correctly. Does this mean one of two things, that there is actually on foreign policy, at any rate, a good deal more consensus in India than on domestic politics, and or that there are, as it were, certain structural conditions in place, and whatever he may want to do, he's bound by them? That raises the question. What, if anything, does a BJP foreign policy mean, as opposed to a Congress foreign policy?
Right. First, I would agree that we are seeing some sort of Modi 2.0, as it were, because the version 1.0 that we were all worried about, including the fire-breathing rhetoric and the overt bigotry, Hindu chauvinism, with which he was long associated, that clearly has been put on the back burner, if not shelved altogether, since his election victory. His language, as I said earlier, has been conciliatory and accommodative. So domestically, we are seeing a Modi 2.0. On foreign policy, there was little to go on before, but his election rhetoric, which was certainly troubling or at least disquieting. And I would suggest that what we are seeing since his ascension suggests that indeed there is the kind of consensus on foreign policy that was only being threatened by the perverse domestic political logic of coalitions. In other words, the basic consensus on foreign policy did cut across parties, but the dependence of a central government on coalition allies that had particular political axes to grind did call that consensus into question. I'll give you two examples. There is universal understanding of the importance of Sri Lanka to India as our nearest neighbor, one with which we have millennial-old ties, and at the same time one which is being assiduously wooed by our strategic rival, if not adversary, China. And yet the ability of the government in Delhi in recent years to woo and cultivate close relations with Sri Lanka was severely constrained by its dependence on the support and votes of a chauvinist Tamil party in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu. Mr. Modi no longer has that constraint. Similarly, his policy on Bangladesh will not depend upon the acquiescence of the equally fiery Chief Minister of West Bengal in India, Mamata Banerjee. However, it should be stressed Mr. Modi only has an absolute majority in the lower house, and that in the upper house he is still dependent on the support of other parties, notably ours, the principal opposition party, the Congress, which has more seats in the upper house for now than Mr. Modi does, because the upper house is elected by state legislatures, and our strength in the upper house reflects a period of dominance in domestic politics, which gave the Congress party 13 state governments out of 28 in India. The BJP, of course, is now poised to seize some of them back in elections. Indian democracy's perversity is that there are elections to one state assembly or another practically every 6 months. So we may be seeing a change in the composition of the upper house as well in the years to come. But certainly for the next year and a half or so, the BJP will be smaller as a party in the upper house than the Congress, and that too will work towards consensus. A final thought, Rajan, is that the Manmohan Singh government had articulated a very clear vision of the place of foreign policy in our priorities. We argued that the entire purpose of foreign policy to us was to serve the interests of our domestic transformation. That is, of actually helping us to attract investment, to develop our country, to abolish poverty, to help bring our people into the 21st century and enhance their life chances and opportunities. To do that, we needed a foreign policy that, for example, enhanced investment in our country, that promoted our energy security, that promoted good relations with countries that were potentially sources of food security, and so on. And therefore, foreign policy was seen very much as a tool to fulfill certain domestic social economic ends, which in turn, of course, had a political justification, because no government can afford to neglect the pressing problems of development and poverty eradication in our country. I think Mr. Modi, approaching it from a different angle, not necessarily with an abiding concern for the poor, but with very much an openness to the business of India being business and economic and trade relations being paramount in his worldview, may end up in the same place. That is, that he may actually subordinate some of the political and other rhetoric I referred to earlier to the purely economic and commercial interests of India and therefore of the Indian people. Which brings him back to the same consensus you asked about. In other words, you may arrive at the same position from different starting points, but at the end you do have agreement and therefore convergence.
Let me quickly ask you a question about the Congress Party, Shashi.
Yes, sir.
Is this really the end of dynastic parties? Is there a possibility of a change in the leadership of the party? And related to that, a question from one of our viewers and listeners from the internet, Anirudh, who asks, do you foresee yourself as making a bid for leadership, perhaps as a prime ministerial candidate in the future?
Not at all. And frankly, this business about the end of dynasty and so on is, to my mind, the kind of superficial and glib analysis from which Indian politics has suffered far too much. First of all, yes, there is undoubtedly a tradition in India of professions being inherited by the children of their practitioners. This is true not only in politics, which is where, by the way, it's widespread, not just in the Congress Party, but in very many of the regional parties, though the BJP, I must admit, is an honorable exception. But dynasty is also prevalent in Bollywood, where the movie stars of today are very often the sons and daughters of the movie stars of yesterday. Whether it's often true in your local cobbler or carpenter who learned his trade from his father or uncle. The practice of professions going down from generation to generation is endemic in our society, and it's going to take more than one election result to transform the possibilities of that. If there are several election results of a certain kind, you may well find the logic being questioned. But because the Indian voter has traditionally, and by traditionally I do mean for all the decades of Indian democracy and indeed of the nationalist movement before that, shown a great deal of respect for families and for identifying certain families with certain values and certain political convictions and roles, what you call dynasty has a deeply entrenched roots in the Indian political space. Furthermore, of course, one of the reasons that the Nehru-Gandhi's DNA has been encoded with the DNA of the Congress Party is precisely that you are actually looking at a family that has won elections. This is not the first electoral defeat the Congress Party has suffered. We went through defeats in 96, 98, and 99, but Sonia Gandhi led us to the victories of 2004 and 2009. And so rather than repudiating the leadership that led us in this defeat of 2014, the instinct of all of us, including myself, is to say, we are counting on you to pull us out of this and lead us forward into a new victory in the next election. You're our leaders, you have a responsibility to get us out of this trough. That's the way in which most Congress people have seen the role of the President Sonia Gandhi and the Vice President Rahul Gandhi. Now, it's early days yet. We are still absorbing and digesting the lessons of this defeat. There is an extensive and serious process of introspection going on. I know both the President and the Vice President are meeting dozens of people daily from across the party and across the country to get a sense of what they believe went wrong and what needs to be done to put it right. This churning within the party will undoubtedly bring about some changes, but not, we believe, at the very top, at least not in the foreseeable future. And I think that we are determined to be a credible, robust, and at the same time constructive opposition, even with our reduced numbers in Parliament, and to continue being a very important voice for an alternative set of beliefs about the way in which India should be domestically and culturally and as a society, and at the same time to hammer away for pluralism, which we in India call secularism, though we don't really imply by the absence of religion, but rather the multiplicity of religions that India is famous for. Will be a voice for inclusion, social justice, inclusive growth in our economy, and for keeping the government of the BJP robust and honest. And as to your internet questioner, Anirudh, let me say to him, thank you for the very kind faith in my abilities. I have no such illusions myself. People who know Indian politics know that I'm far too new an entrant into Indian politics after an extensive international career to have any such aspirations or delusions for myself. But thank you nonetheless for that vote of confidence.
Let me go on to Rajan to see if he has another question, and then after him to Bharat, because we realize that your time is short. So
I'm afraid those will have to be the last two questions,
yes.
Shuja.
Yes.
Shashi, a question about our home state, if you will. By the way, congratulations for winning from Thiruvananthapuram.
Thank you.
One of the things that's been said about the BJP, it probably will be said less now, is that it has by and large been a North Indian party, cowbelt party, if you will. Is that changing, or are you struck by the fact that in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka and certainly in Kerala, it hasn't put down deep roots? And if that is true, and I defer to you, what does that mean in terms of its future as a political party?
Well, I think we are witnessing now the beginnings of a very serious and determined effort by the BJP to become a truly pan-national party. I think the BJP has identified, already before this election, that its principal weakness was, number one, its identification with a particular form of religious bigotry, the political agenda of Hindutva. Second, that its identification with a purely Hindi-speaking population excluded the entire South, the entire Northeast, and parts of the East, and that as a result, it was actually having to win a majority out of a smaller base than a party like the Congress, which could get its majority everywhere. In fact, it's striking that even in our dismal performance of only 44 seats, those 44 seats are scattered throughout the country. That we may have only had one or two here and there, but they go from the north to the south, from the east to the west. The BJP is still struggling to have that kind of presence, but they're determined to acquire it. They've made a couple of impressive breakthroughs for the first time in this election. They won a seat in the northeast in Arunachal Pradesh, and they've rewarded the victor with a ministry as Minister of State for Home Affairs, a very sensitive portfolio. They won a seat in Tamil Nadu. That was a surprise. The BJP's head in Tamil Nadu won the seat of Kanyakumari, right next door to my own constituency in Kerala, Thiruvananthapuram. And he did so partly because the non-BJP vote was split amongst 5 parties, but nonetheless that is an important breakthrough. And he also can point to alliances with a number of regional parties in Tamil Nadu on the platform of which further support could be built. In Kerala, there is really only one constituency where the BJP is truly strong, and that happens to be mine. And they came perilously close. In fact, at one point, they were leading in the vote count until I broke through in the last few rounds of counting and emerged with a majority of just 15,700, which is somewhat more modest than my majority last time around of 100,000. So very clearly the BJP did make inroads there. In Karnataka, they managed to win quite a few seats. And in Andhra Pradesh, though they didn't win any, they won, in a sense, a foothold through an ally in the NDA, the Telugu Desam party, which swept that state. So it would be wrong to suggest that the BJP's political footprint is totally absent from these areas. It still is a relatively minor foothold rather than a footprint, but it's there, and I'm certain that there will be very conscientious attempts made to grow it. And one way they will try and do it, of course, is to poach people from other parties, including my party, because there may have been people who were sympathetic to some things that the BJP believed in, but said there's no point supporting them or voting for them because they haven't got a chance. Suddenly, we've now seen through Narendra Modi that they not only have a chance, they can actually win an absolute majority. And there must be some politicians, and opportunistic politicians are hardly a rare phenomenon even in America, whose loyalties to their present parties may well be wavering. We saw a number of people switching already during the election and just before the election. I suspect that in the months to come, this will be one way in which the BJP will augment its presence in places where it doesn't have one right now in order to be a truly national party. One footnote comment is that in the long term, this may not be unhealthy for India. If we can move away from this generation of unstable or rickety coalitions dependent on the largesse of very parochial and often caste-based sectarian regional or state parties, if we can move away from that era to one in which Indian voters are confronted with a genuine choice between two alternative national parties with increasingly contrasting national visions, both in terms of economics and society, and perhaps one day even nuances of difference in foreign policy, though they're not significant right now. I think that kind of choice would be, in the long-term health of the Indian polity, far better for the Indian voter than the kind of multiplicity of choices that on one recent occasion gave us 85 parties in parliament. Even now, with the BJP's crushing majority, there are still over 40 parties that are represented, very often with just one member in the parliament. And I can't believe that that is particularly healthy for Indian democracy. Last question, sorry.
Yes, Bharat, yours.
Shashi, I read your article.
I seem to have lost Bharat, I'm afraid. I've lost Bharat.
I'm so sorry about that. We are grateful.
He's come back. He's come back.
One of the points there was articulating a vision for the future, for especially the young aspirants in India. What is the vision in your thought?
Right. Well, since many of you lost the first half of Bharat's question, he was clearly referring to an article I published in our popular news magazine, India Today, in which I suggested 8 things the Congress Party could and should do to revive itself. And one of them was to articulate a vision for the future for India's increasingly young electorate. This time around, 40% of the electorate was under 35, and next time that percentage will only increase. In fact, the next 2 or 3 times it will increase until we will have an election one day in which a majority of voters are under 35. That's the way the Indian population graph is heading. So if you want to be viable over the next couple of decades, you're going to have to cater to the aspirations of young voters. The BJP was surprisingly quicker off the mark in doing that than we were. And I would argue that at the moment, in the present state of our economy and indeed of the global economy, what young people are most anxiously looking for is assurances for jobs, that is employment, and for adequate education and training opportunities to get them that employment. And these 2 things are areas in which the Congress Party has done some thinking, has a clear vision, but has clearly failed to communicate it, and perhaps has failed to implement it. I mean, that's something we have to admit. So we need to be able to say to voters, this is what we're going to be doing for you, both in terms of getting you decent education and or vocational training, to equip you for the employment opportunities that 21st century India offers you. And that is the message we have to do, not only in terms of election rhetoric. We have to actually implement our ideas for both education and vocational training, and therefore employment generation. First of all, in the states which we are now ruling, and second, in terms of the policies we advocate in the center where the BJP is now ruling, in the federal government. So this is my message. If we can do that, we can credibly point to young people saying, look, these are what we stand for. If the BJP had only listened to us, this is what you would have had. That gives an alternative to whatever the BJP does. Obviously, the BJP may well steal our thunder and do precisely what I'm recommending. But I feel that, at least for now, where we're running more states than the BJP is, and we do have more experienced voices at the national level than the BJP has, we should put these issues up front in our messaging.
Thank you very much, Shashi. We really appreciate you taking this time, and we hope we can connect with you again. We are going to carry on our discussion, and in a little while connect with a person from the BJP to hear from them. I think the gist of what you're saying is the election is over. It was a great victory for the BJP, but now comes the really tough part, which is translating the promises to meet the heightened expectations of the people, and especially the youth. So we look forward to seeing your progress, your party's progress, and of course seeing how the BJP tackles this great victory.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the interaction. I'm assuming that a link to this webcast will be available in your archive, so I can tweet it, and those who missed it today can listen to it later. Do send that to me, or have your staff send it to me. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your discussion.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye. Well, we can carry on in the meantime. I think Pradyut is almost ready to join us. If he is, then we don't have to talk amongst ourselves. We've just said goodbye.
Yes, very much. I'm kind of ready to join you.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's good to see you again, even though it's virtually. So delighted to have you online. For those who are following us on this Google Hangout, just a few words on my part about Pradyut. He's an Indian politician, currently a national executive member of the Bharatiya Janata Party. Previously, he was the state general secretary for BJP Assam, the national convener of their information technology cell, and a member of the national media cell. He's directed a private media software company for 6 years before entering politics, and is also a well-known commentator in the Indian media. His pieces have been carried in the Indian Express, the Times of India, the Economic Times, and the Pioneer, and we were delighted to meet him on his last trip to Washington, and delighted now to connect with him again. So I'm going to, instead of posing the first question, go back to Rajan and offer him the opportunity of a comment or a question from our friend from the BJP.
Mr. Bora, a pleasure to meet you. Congratulations on your party's victory.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to meet you too.
And all the best. Now, hearing Shashi, I don't know if you heard him, but the burden of his characterization of your party's victory was that it ran an extraordinarily smart campaign. It's putting down roots nationwide, which it never did before, at least to this degree, and that in foreign policy, we're likely to see a rather similar policy than the Congress followed, because Mr. Modi is a pragmatist and a manager and a can-do person, and he has the same constraints and opportunities as his predecessors had. That having been said, what is the BJP's foreign policy outlook? What is its view of the world, and what distinctions can be drawn between what the Congress stands for and what your party stands for?
Well, I think the foreign policy of the Congress is largely a throwback to the Cold War era, and a throwback to Nehru and his policy of non-alignment. And I think it was the BJP during our regime that clearly articulated that the United States and India, we make for natural allies. And I think this is a fundamental shift that we saw between what the Congress considers their foreign policy and what we consider ours. So a BJP regime, I think, would see a closer relationship with the West, with the developing world, the United States. And I think it is going to be an India which is much more sure of itself.
On China, if I could just follow up, largely seen as India's either greatest competitor or adversary, but in economic terms and military terms, far ahead, but also now, if I'm not mistaken, India's largest trade partner. So opportunities for cooperation, potential for conflict. How do you size up the China issue?
Well, I think BJP is fairly cognizant of this blow hot and blow cold relationship with China, and also the kind of potentialities of cooperation and the current difficulties that we have. I think Mr. Modi, when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, made, if I'm not mistaken, 2 trips to China. Definitely one that I kind of remember. And he was fairly impressed with what he saw. And in several of his talks, he used to kind of benchmark his state against China. And I distinctly remember a couple of his speeches where he says that Gujarat doesn't compete with the other states in India, it competes with China. China has 10% growth and my state has 10% growth. I think growth is something that's kind of, Mr. Modi is going to kind of benchmark with China. I think Mr. Modi is also kind of going to look at China on India's terms and not necessarily through the lens of the West.
Thank you.
Bharat, you want to pick up on that?
I want to pick up, but I want to pick up on where part of Sashi's comments did. One of the things, the same India Today carries an article by Pradeep Chipper that says 83% of Indians voted for a decisive leader, and while 69% voted for an inclusive leader. So clearly they valued a decisive leader more as a priority than an inclusive leader. And in that, today's Deccan Herald carries a 10-point agenda that Modi has set a minister's 100-day target, which basically says bring stability and sustainability in government policies, confidence in bureaucracy. And you must have read all the agenda that Modi has set for his ministers in 100 days. How realistic do you think this is?
I'm sorry, Bharat, I missed the last sentence of yours.
How realistic do you think is Modi's 10-point agenda in 100 days from now?
Well, I think it's sure. I mean, if I know Mr. Modi well, I think he's realist and a pragmatist over anything else. And I think he has got his plans pretty well drawn out. And I think he's going to go there. To the best of my knowledge, an order has already gone out to ministers that they need to put in at least 16 hours of work a day. And I think it is this 16 hours of work that each minister puts in that's going to put the government on turbo mode, if you please. And that's how he's kind of going to go there. I think the country has an immense amount of expectations of Mr. Modi. That is, hope was the overriding sentiment that was sold. And hope is something that doesn't last too long. You've got 100 days to deliver hope, or it becomes hopelessness. So I think Mr. Modi understands the importance of what he said to the electorate. And I think it's going to come about by a basic reconfiguration of government. One of the things that we have already seen in the last couple of days is the downsizing of government. During his campaign, Mr. Modi talked about minimum government, maximum governance. The argument was if the United States could run itself with 11 cabinet ministers, why do we need a jumbo cabinet of so many cabinet ministers? And why do we need so much of red tape? So the way to cut red tape is downsize government, empower decision making, and accountability. And I think this is what he has set in motion.
If I can pick up on that, one of the injunctions in the list of 10 that was reported from the cabinet meeting was that he exhorted his ministers as well as the bureaucrats to improve their performance on the basis of much better communications with the states. He told them to listen to the states and to respond rapidly. to them. One thing we've noticed, not just in India, but in the region, in Pakistan also, that the power is moving fairly rapidly from the center to the periphery, to the provinces, and to the states in India. As Shashi also mentioned in his comments, the BJP doesn't control all the states. So there will need to be much more collaboration with the states and their governments. And the less government is really going to be based on more government at the local level and much less interference from Delhi. What do you think will be the effective policy of Mr. Modi, particularly if he's going to try and change things in a hurry to meet these expectations that he's raised through a very effective campaign?
Sure. One of the things Mr. Modi has announced is a Prime Minister's office in every state capital. Now, a president's office or a prime minister's office is an office that is in the national capital. But Mr. Modi has announced an extended office in every state capital so as to monitor development. Mr. Modi has been a chief minister himself, and possibly the only prime minister of India who has been a chief minister and then straight moved to the prime minister's office. So he knows the challenges at the local level. He knows the challenges of coordination between the center and the states. He knows that the structure, our constitutional structure and our taxation structure is very much weighed in favor of the center. And he knows the challenges that states have to face in going to the center and begging for funds. He also knows that once funds come to the states, the challenges of accountability, that there's very little accountability of central funds going to the states. So his challenges are therefore that how do you kind of reduce the need for states to come to the center with a begging bowl, number one. Number two, the funds having been allocated in a more just and or justifiable manner, how do you ensure that every rupee spent by the government, a maximum amount of it really reaches the intended beneficiary? I'm sure you know of Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's very famous comment of of every rupee the central government spends on development, only about 12 to 15% reaches the intended beneficiary. The rest, 85 to 88%, is either spent on bureaucratic overheads or is simply kind of leaked from the development pipeline to corruption and to all other ills. So therefore, how do you get the maximum bang for the central government, the federal government's development aid? So these are some of the challenges that he has kind of faced himself in his role as chief minister. And now, having become prime minister, he is putting in place the institutional mechanism to really address these challenges. And the first is an extension of the prime minister's office in every state capital. So you want to access the prime minister, you don't really have to come to Delhi. You go to your state capital.
Rajan?
Thank you. I was struck by your very refreshingly honest statement on the BJP and the United States, and you spoke of a natural alignment. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but let me ask you what that means in concrete terms, because there is the usual pablum about two democracies, economic opportunity, but let's look at some specific things. On the military front, as you well know, about 80% of India's force structure is now based on weapons of Russian/Soviet origin. Do you see a change there? Not immediately, but over time. Do you have in mind an alliance or an alignment? And if so, underpinning that, would the country that is really the occasion for that alignment be China? And I would also like to ask you a question about Israel, because there has been over the years in the BJP a great deal of a positive attitude toward Israel, a sense that opportunity has been missed. Do you see any changes in Indian-Israeli relationships under the BJP, Mr. Modi having been to Israel at least on 2 occasions?
Sure. Yes, I think there would be a change in India's relationship with Israel, but that change would only be positive. I think it's only going to increase with a BJP regime, number one. Number two, as far as the United States is concerned, and particularly with defense, I mean, the party is yet to come out with a defense strategy document or a defense vision document. So I'm merely kind of anticipating, or I'm merely kind of articulating what I suspect may end up to be my party's defense plan. But I think one of the pillars of the Indian defense establishment has been the emphasis on indigenization. I think I think one of the things that would be of interest to the BJP, with particularly the United States, therefore, is kind of technology transfer. And I think the ability to work out a deal whereby the United States gets a market, we get technology, is something I think that could possibly work during this time. India has kind of realized its military challenges. It very clearly needs a two-frontier land force. It clearly wants a blue water navy with power projection capabilities far out to the sea. It has got a certain vision for the Air Force, and I think it's going to require massive inputs of technology. And I think the kind of stasis, or the kind of paralysis in defense procurement that has kind of come about in the last 10 years, the refusal to take a decision, key acquisitions are pending. I think we have to make up for lost time. And you can only make up for lost time by really thinking out of the box. Now, what are the exact elements of those out of the box thinking? I can only speculate. And I think it would have to be really creative thinking in the realm of technology acquisition.
If I could just very quickly, do you anticipate, and I know it's early days yet, but do you anticipate, for example, a diversification, however small to begin with, in India's defense procurement as regards other countries?
I think so. I mean, I think so. See, there is a kind of a natural tension between our defense production establishment and the people who actually kind of use the end user. And I think this is kind of only natural, that if I'm an end user, I really want the latest in the world, the latest in technology, and there's of course always a gap between what is available, the latest available in the world markets, and what we would be producing at kind of that very moment. So I think so. I mean, I would think that should we want to kind of bridge that gap, we have to go shopping. And we might therefore have to kind of diversify our sourcing bases, our sourcing the technologies that we source. But I wouldn't want to comment too much on it, because it's kind of really treading into fine ground, and I'd much rather wait for my party to articulate its stand on this particular point. At this point in time, we have a minister who is handling both finance and defense, and he has already announced that we'll possibly get a new defense minister in the next couple of weeks. And I think it would be very interesting to see what India's new defense minister would have to say about the ground that we lost in the last couple of years.
If I could just quickly enter this before I ask Bharat to pick up on this, because this is an area of his expertise. But one thing that strikes me is that there's been really no vigorous debate inside India about this, and particularly on the question of import substitution versus import of arms and technology from overseas. Although India is now probably the largest importer of arms in the world, but yet there is going to be very powerful opposition inside India from institutions that have controlled defense production inside India, and that have been sclerotic at best in terms of their ability to acquire technology and amend it to their uses and release it to the forces that need them to fight with. So how, if any, efforts are going to be made, how will the party be able to organize a change in this whole bureaucratic system that has been in place in India for decades? And I'm going to stop here and then let Bharat pick up on this because he may add to this. Go ahead, Bharat.
Yeah, this is music to my ears. The first is the last 5 years. I just met a general and an air vice marshal, both who intersected in their comments. I'll quote what they said to me was, the former defense minister was hopeless. He killed all our enthusiasm, number one. And the air vice marshal said, for the first time in 60 years, I see a hope in this government in terms of defense. Okay, so I think what they essentially were referring is the paralysis at the highest levels in the Ministry of Defense. The next thing, something interesting that I heard was, it's not only going to become an importer, but a part of Tata Industries, which is in defense as a private actor, is also responsible for manufacturing some of the the tail sections of a fighter aircraft that I don't wish to reveal, and export it to the United States back. And what he sees, the Indian government or the governments, both governments haven't struck a deal yet to assemble these components or integrate these components inside India. And they want to push it through the government so that it can become an assembly hub and start exporting equipment outside. Okay, and I think you will find a strong lobbyist from the private and the public sector. The public sector will try to refuse this because they will lose their relevance, like the HAL and the National Aerospace Laboratory. They'll try to refuse this. But the private actors are pushing very hard. Mahindra Aerospace and Tata Defense, or whatever they're called, is going to become. You'll have what essentially will be. You'll have a very strong interest from the private sector being to dominate in this sector. The third thing I wanted to go back to Rajan's point is diversification. Yes, Indians are extremely comfortable dealing with the Israelis. They say getting to a contract, clinching a deal on the contract with the Israelis is extremely difficult. But once it's signed, the implementation proceeds without any problems. Whereas the problems with the United States start once you sign the contract, and they cite the State Department to be the most horrendous player in this. They say, like I've often said, the DoD looks for opportunities and the state looks for problems, and that's where the State Department comes in.
Rajat, would you have a response to that comment?
Well, I just missed the last part of the last sentence of what Bharat said. Bharat, if you could just speak the last sentence, and then I'll come back.
The last sentence is essentially, the point is essentially, Indians are very comfortable dealing with the Israelis and the United States, and there is a decrease in confidence with the Russian supplied equipment. So with the BJP government in power, and I think I also saw an article where Shishma Bharat said Israel is one of our favorite countries. So you will see an increasing, your trade with Israel is defense imports from Israel is going to increase, and so is with the United States also. It's problematic, but Indians are cognizant to realize some of the best technologies that are the state-of-the-art technologies available today are with the United States, especially when it comes to people. So
I just pick up on what Bharat said kind of earlier on in his points. That about the domestic pressure from India's own private sector in the field of defense and aerospace. We have some very good Indian companies, old Indian companies, which have traditionally been in other fields, in FMCG goods and automobiles and so on and so forth, and heavy engineering and so on and so forth. And now they have progressively been partnering the Indian governments defense production efforts. Companies like Mahindra, companies like L&T, companies like BHEL, and so on and so forth. So this need to kind of acquire technology, need to kind of partner, need to be kind of opening up, the need to kind of open up our defense production process is a pressure not just from overseas or the United States, but there's also a huge amount of domestic pressure that if India could do so well in IT by letting the IT sector be handled by the private players, why couldn't India be a technology leader by letting in the private sector? So there's a huge amount of pressure internally as well. And I think so, and which is why I do not want to kind of anticipate what the new government might kind of announce. When BJP took office in 2008-2009, it announced a new telecom policy. There could be a possibility, and I said this is a possibility, that we might have a new defense acquisition policy. So I think, but it would be best to wait for the new defense minister to take office, which should be in about another 3 to 4 weeks, and to await what the thinking of the new government would be.
Let me go back to foreign policy again, a topic that Rajan has been following in our discussions. Ask you about the relationship with two neighbors, Bangladesh and Pakistan. On Bangladesh, there is still this lingering concern from the election rhetoric about the so-called 20 million Bangladeshi refugees, sending them back to Bangladesh. There was the failed attempt of the previous government to reach agreement on the water in the Farakka barrage. On Pakistan, how did you read the tea leaves following the visit for the inauguration of Prime Minister Modi, and will Pakistan be able to deliver its side of the bargain enough for Prime Minister Modi to take certain steps that will allay Pakistani concerns, particularly on the trade front? So do you expect rapid movement on that front, or is this one of those boxes that has been checked off for now, and the concentration will be more on the domestic scene?
No, I don't think this is something that would be ticked off the box for now to come back at a later date. I think this is pretty much on the agenda. It's pretty much on the table, and I think Mr. Modi sent out a very, very powerful signal when he invited the leaders of all our neighboring countries to his inauguration. I think, after having said what he said during the campaign, during his campaign speeches, I think inviting the governments of the government leaders of Pakistan and Bangladesh would have been the last thing on people's mind, and it came as a complete surprise to most people, and possibly it gives an early indication of Mr. Modi's ambitions for India, that if India is to play its rightful role in the world, you need a very strong and a very cooperative neighborhood. As regards trade, I think the government has already signaled to Pakistan its intentions to go forward on trade.
Well, looks like we've lost Pradyut for the time being. Maybe we'll continue this discussion amongst those of us that are still able to connect. So let me come back to Rajan and see if he can talk about these two points that I made about Bangladesh and Pakistan. Rajan, what do you think?
Shuja, one of the things that I have been thinking about, and I think you and I may have talked about this at one point, is whether for India the nature of the Pakistan problem, to the extent that it's a problem, has changed in the following way. For most of India's post-independent history, the question has been the Pakistani threat, defined as a united Pakistan that has a certain amount of military power and now nuclear weapons as well. And in my discussions with Indian strategists in recent years, especially those from the military, retired military people, they say, well, look, that continues. But there's a new problem, and that is now not the cohesion of Pakistan as a threat, but its incoherence and potentially its disunity. That strikes me, if anything, as a much more vexed and difficult problem to deal with. And that's one thing I wanted to ask Mr. Bora, and we'll try to do so when I come back. And the second question is really, what will be the first big test that the BJP faces? I mean, I can envisage one, for instance. As ISAF troops start cycling out of Afghanistan, as they're doing now, and the United States, leaves behind about 9,800 troops or so, primarily involved not in counterinsurgency, but in other backroom operations. There's going to be a competition that heats up for the future of Afghanistan, and India and Pakistan are already on the ground. One of the ways in which Pakistan has sought to make life difficult for India is, according to the Indian position anyway, by suborning terrorist attacks. Well, let's assume that that sort of escalates and there's an attack on the homeland. The BJP is in a very difficult position because it's on the one hand presented itself as the strong government that will brook no such behavior from adversaries. On the other hand, there is the minor matter of nuclear weapons and a substantial land force that Pakistan still has. So the question is, what will be the BJP's new attitude toward terrorism? Will it be, in fact, anything different from the Congress, or will it be a rather more continuity?
We discussed Afghanistan in particular just over an hour ago with Ashraf Ghani, because we had a Skype session with him, and he was talking in terms of regional stability and the role of the neighbors. The question really is, who ends up creating the conditions under which both India and Pakistan see their role in Afghanistan as being positive rather than competing for control or influence inside Afghanistan. At the moment, within Pakistan, there is apparently disunity between the military and the civil government on many of the details of their engagement in the region. Much of the public discussion focuses on the fact that the civilian government wants to move very rapidly to build trade relations with India. The military wants a much wider dialogue and therefore doesn't want them to move far too quickly on the non-discriminatory access, for instance. On Afghanistan, there may still be elements within the military that want to continue to see if they can produce a government to their liking in Kabul. And yet there is, at the government level, a desire for a different, much more engaged relationship with whichever person is elected as president of Afghanistan. So those tensions will remain. On the Indian side, the advantage is that you have a strong leader. He is not beholden to any other party. He can certainly show some ability to give concessions to the smaller countries in the region, including Pakistan, on the trade front, and through that open up the door to working together in Afghanistan. It's going to take a lot of effort, and I just wonder whether Prime Minister Modi or Prime Minister Sharif, for instance, have the ability to devote so much attention to this issue in Afghanistan particularly, which is going to unfold very rapidly.
Absolutely, and there are so many players, Shuja, inside and outside Pakistan, as you know,
yes,
better than I, that a lot of the circumstances are not beyond their control. The other thing I was going to ask Mr. Bora is this. India may be the only country in Asia, or one of the few, that's not at all disquieted by Shinzo Abe's changes in Japanese defense policy. In fact, it seems rather delighted. And the Congress has, over the years, built up a fair amount of mill-to-mill contact with Japan, military exercises, and so on. Mr. Abe was the chief guest at India's last Republic Day. If I'm not mistaken, he was invited for the inaugural. And what is interesting is that both Shashi and Mr. Bora said, look, for India, development and security are two sides of one coin. Well, Japan, like the United States, can deliver on both fronts, technology transfer, and while it can't deliver the kind of defense balancing potential that the United States can, Japan, in fact, has a fairly substantial military apparatus, and it's situated on China's eastern flank. So one of the things I would see, in addition to changes with Israel and the United States, look very closely at where the Indians and the Japanese take this relationship, because it's potentially one of the more interesting post-Cold War shifts.
Yes. Maybe Bharat can join this discussion at this point while we wait for Pradyut to come back online. I hope he's able to.
Yeah, no, I'll go on to the regional integration stuff. I think Modi has been extremely smart by inviting all SAARC leaders to begin with. As we all know, South Asia is the least integrated region, but also the most populous region. And I think in one of the speeches in Ahmedabad, I quote Modi, he said, the only solution to every problem is development. Without that, India's destiny will not change. The road to achieving this objective lies through peace and stability in India's immediate neighborhood. So he's clearly recognized where he begins his foreign policy of India, which has traditionally been West-centered. So that's point number one. And and I think inviting Nawaz Sharif in the framework of SAARC was also in some ways a signal to critics who suggested that he would take a hard line on Pakistan. So this was in domestic terms saying that I am willing to engage with the neighborhood and especially with Pakistan, but on my own terms. Like Nawaz Sharif invited him to Pakistan, but Modi just gave him the invitation and asked him to come to India for a swearing-in ceremony. This is something like in military you have a saying: amateurs talk strategy, professionals logistics. Here is the invite. You come and put Nawaz Sharif on the defensive and try to make him deliver on what India's demands are. So that would be a key point in the immediate neighborhood. On defense, yes, I agree with you. I think it would be very good to see where India and Japan take this relationship forward. I think in the last 1 year or something, you've had 4 or 5 high-level visits from Japan, including the Indian Prime Minister going there. I think the Foreign Secretary, Sujata Singh, was in Japan just before Modi's inauguration, or sometime late in April, early May. And Japan has been, and likewise, Japan has been hinting, not hinting openly, expressing closer desire to engage with India. We'll have to wait and watch where this goes, but I would be very curious to also see where they take this forward.
Let me ask you a question, Bharat, on this point. There's been some speculation that Prime Minister Modi is thinking of appointing a senior level person as a national foreign policy advisor, similar in stature to national security advisor. Is this his attempt to bypass the bureaucracy in some way?
I would think yes, it is, because I know the first BJP government also created the post of the national security advisor, which was absent until then. And in some ways, although it could not execute it, it played a very strong advisory role to the government. And Shiv Shankar Menon, if you know, he had tremendous powers within the government. So I think Modi would be smart Modi is smart and would be smart to have that kind of a role, that kind of a position created where he is able to take decisions to a different channel if needed be.
Thank you. I see Pradyut is back after a short break, so welcome back, Pradyut.
I'm sorry, it was a completely unintended break. Windows decided to kind of update itself.
I see.
Without my permission.
That's the problem when you're dealing with such a large corporation. It controls everything.
That's why
we had some discussions amongst ourselves about foreign policy issues, including a question from me to Bharat about the speculation that Prime Minister Modi might appoint a senior person as a foreign policy advisor along the lines of the National Security Advisor, and whether this was a way to bypass the bureaucracy. But Rajan also had a couple of questions for you, so let me go to him first, and then perhaps you can join the conversation. And we will promise to let you go earlier because we started earlier with you. So Rajan, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Bora. Welcome back. On the Windows problem, you might be careful about technology transfer from the United States. In that respect, I wanted to ask you about defense procurement and also Japan, and they're not entirely related. On defense procurement, I understand the point that both you and Bharat made about the desirability of defense diversification, not only as a technological matter, but also as a matter of reducing dependence on any one source. But the fact of the matter is that you have an Indian force structure that is heavily reliant on use to Soviet and Russian weapons. And despite the problems relating to the quality and timeliness of spare parts supply, the explosion on the Sindhu Rakshak, the cost overruns on the Vikramaditya, Russia has been the most reliable arms supplier. So in the short and cost competitive. And so in the short run, you're the expert and I'm not, but I'm rather skeptical about a very radical change. As for Israel, drones and armor and so on, but I think kind of at the margins. So that's one question. How quickly do you think it'll happen? Second, on Japan, I was saying to my colleagues here that India is among a small number of countries that's not at all alarmed by Mr. Abe's changes in defense policy. It can contribute to India's security and India's economic well-being as well. The Congress Party has nurtured this relationship with Mr. Abe. Do you anticipate Mr. Modi taking it even further?
Absolutely. I think the Indo-Japan relationship is kind of going to take incremental forward steps, and I think Mr. Modi would take forward the developments that Mr. Manmohan Singh and Mr. Abe, they both kind of shared. And I think the government of India has already made announcements regarding regarding support from Japan, regarding collaborating with Japan on naval platforms. And I think naval cooperation is an area that we might see with Japan going forward. Again, however, I'd like to kind of emphasize the point I made early on, that we are going to see a new defense minister in 3 to 4 weeks. Who that person is going to be another signaling point about the government of India's intentions. And I think I would wait for these next couple of weeks to hear from the government as to what is it that they are going to do differently on Indian defense. Clearly, there is an appreciation that we have lost massive ground in this last 10 years. How quickly we are going to make up for those lost years? And what different in thinking, what new thoughts are we going to kind of bring about as we look forward? I would wait for this 3 to 4 weeks and not try to kind of speculate too much.
Understood.
Can I just jump in here?
Sure.
I think, Rajan, going back to your India-Japan question, I think there is a tweet from Modi that says, "I'm sure we'll take India-Japan ties to newer heights." And I think it was also the Japanese, after Modi's, after he won the election, the Japanese, apparently he had 3 conversations with Abe. That's the most conversations that he's had with any particular leader. And today they stand with the India-Japan trade is at $18 billion. And in the conference in Japan that he's spoken earlier, he's expressed a keen desire for the Japanese to help with the Indian manufacturing and the Japanese help in developing the Indian manufacturing sector, as well as competitiveness for constructing smart cities. He's also requested assistance from them for the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor on high-speed, assistance on high-speed rail. So these are issues that he's clearly looking at Japan, and that, and I think you'll see the Congress has noted it, and Modi is just going to increase the momentum in this relationship. And with regard to your question on Russia, I wouldn't see radical, but you will see an increase in. It wouldn't be radical, but it would be a gradual shift, and a shift that will also increase in its momentum um, towards Israel and the United States.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pradeep.
No, I would pretty much echo what Bharat said, is that as far as Japan is concerned, I don't think there's going to be anything radical, but it's definitely going to be several positive steps forward. Mr. Modi has already announced during his campaign speeches of creating 100 new cities, 100 new cities, and with high-speed rail kind of connecting all of them. He has spoken about, as Bharat pointed out, a Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, which is almost about 2,000 kilometers long. And I think those are some areas that Indo-Japan collaboration is going to take to a new high. And that that collaboration in urbanization might kind of spill over even to more enhanced defense cooperation.
Pradyut, if I may leap in before we run out of time, and I promised to let you go early because you were kind enough to join us earlier. My friend Ashutosh Varshney wrote a piece in The Guardian recently after the elections, in which he said that the Prime Minister elect at that time was seeking to, quote, reshape the entire political universe of India. Now, soon after that, we had the Minister of State in the Prime Minister's office, Jatendra Singh, who is from Jammu and Kashmir, from Udhampur, triggering controversy when he pitched for a debate on BJP's stand demanding the repeal of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution as it relates to the status of Kashmir.
Sure.
Mr. Singh later retracted that statement, saying that the controversy is totally baseless, but by that time the debate was already joined in the public sphere. Do you think that Mr. Modi will seek such far-reaching changes, and if this were to continue, how would that affect the relationship with the people of Kashmir on the one hand, then of course how would it affect Pakistan?
Sure. I mean, it's definitely is a difficult tightrope, but we must understand that Article 370 is a BJP policy which has been in place for a very, very long time. The abolition of Article 370 and a complete integration of Kashmir with India in terms of its structures, in terms of its governance structures. So that's been a long-standing BJP policy. At the same time, BJP is pretty much aware of the situation on the ground and the sensitivities of the people of Kashmir. So how we are going to reconcile these two seemingly contradictory positions is something that will require a lot of creative thinking. While we take care, or while we have this challenge internally, we also are kind of understand the impact that this situation might have on our relationship with Pakistan. So I think the government has been in office only less than a week, and this is something that the government will sooner or later need to figure out, because this issue having been raised by a minister in the Prime Minister's office is going to again kind of surface. And I think it is important, therefore, for the government to really figure out how it's kind of going to deal with something which has been BJP policy for a long time. And yet, given the situation, given the volatile situation, is something which is very sensitive both internally and externally.
Well, both India and Pakistan, in my view, need to look very carefully at the Kashmiri population and their views, because the demographic shifts that have occurred within Kashmir have brought forward a youthful cohort that is now very active in politics. It affects both countries, and they are loath to allow either India or Pakistan to make decisions that affect them. it was interesting that Chief Minister Omar Abdullah's very strong statement in which he said, in his tweet, he said, "Mark my words and save this tweet. Long after Modi government is a distant memory, either J&K won't be part of India or Article 370 will still exist." So that's pretty strong words. I think it's going to be a challenge for...
No, I think those words are really uncalled for from a constitutional authority who has sworn himself to uphold the Indian Constitution. And so a constitutional authority speaking about a J&K that's not a part of India is something which is kind of condemnable. And I think the party has said so in so many words. But I think we need to go beyond rhetoric and look for practical solutions. And given Mr. Modi's swearing in and ceremony and his first day in office, where he had very fruitful talks with Mr. Nawaz Sharif, I'm extremely hopeful that we might achieve some breakthrough in these 5 years.
Well, we echo your optimism on this, particularly from our vantage point at the South Asia Center, where we are devoted to being a forum for this kind of discussion in the region. And we welcome the chance of speaking with you now and hope that we can come back maybe 100 days from now and see where we stand. Let me ask my colleagues if they have any last comments or questions, and then we'll ask you to wrap it up for us.
One last one, Shuja, if I might.
Please.
So, Mr. Bora, the BJP is presented, and you may argue that it's presented this way unfairly, as a Hindu nationalist party devoted to Hindutva and so on. I'm sure you've heard this, and I don't need to tell you the narrative. But it occurs to me that among the Indian Muslim population of about 170 million, of course it's very divided and very diverse, but I think the vote spoke for itself. There were very few votes for the BJP. When I think of internal threats to India's security, the mismanagement of the relationship with the Muslim community, Indian Muslim citizens, is very high up on my personal list. Does the BJP have homework to do to reassure Indian Muslims that it is a party of all Indians? Has its message been misunderstood? What thoughts do you have on this?
First thing I'll kind of react to, Mr. Jaitley. Number one is that I think a substantial amount of Indian Muslims have voted for the BJP this time. All the figures, all the electoral figures haven't come in, all the reports haven't come in. So I may not be able to kind of give you data, but intuitively I can say that BJP could not possibly have won so many seats without a significant portion of Indian Muslims voting for the BJP. In my own state of Assam, in the northeast corner, we have a 33% Muslim population. And the BJP won 7 out of the 14 seats. And again, that could not have happened without a significant number, or at least a decent number of Muslims voting for the BJP, number one. So statistically, whatever you said can be questioned, number one.
I just number want to make sure you understand what I'm asking. I'm not saying that no Indian Muslims voted for the BJP. That's obviously not true. But the proportion that did is rather small, and that may be for many reasons.
Yeah. No, but I think it has been kind of an improvement compared to previous times, a significant improvement compared to previous times, number one. And I'll just wait for a couple of weeks for this detailed statistics to come out, and then maybe I could make my case more strongly, number one. Number two, during his election, Mr. Modi made a very powerful statement. His statement was, the Hindus of India have to decide whether they want to fight Muslims or they want to fight poverty. The Muslims of the Muslims of India have to decide whether they want to fight Hindus or they want to fight the poverty. And I think that's a message. It's kind of gone down well with many people. We have been branded, I would argue, unfairly so, as a Hindu communal party. I think in my own speeches, I said, look, we are not the Hindu Janata Party, we are not the Muslim Janata Party, we are not the Christian Janata Party, we are the Bharatiya Janata Party. right? And I think what Mr. Modi said about fighting each other or fighting poverty is a message that has reached a significant portion of Indian Muslims. But I think action has to speak louder than words, and the next 100 days and the next 5 years is going to kind of bring about a new image of the BJP, and hopefully a new idea of India, which has been very different from the last 60 years, the Congress's idea of India.
Thank you. Bharat, your final comments, and then we will close.
I just wanted to, there is actually a statistics that is, I'd refer to the India Today article by Pradeep Chipper, which says only 80% voted for a decisive leader, which explains Modi's mandate. Contrary to popular perception, an inclusive leader is what Muslim voters least wanted. They rather wanted a decisive leader. So which attests to your point that it was not the religion aspect that even the Muslims wanted. It was more the growth and the development aspect what the Muslims wanted, and somebody who could take decisions at the highest level. This is a feeling that's echoed across even anecdotal evidences that I encountered, whether it may be in auto rickshaws, it may be with the army, it may be with the man on the street, or with the tea stalls where politics is often discussed.
Thank you, Bharat.
No, I think there is more to anecdotal evidence than what he said. Bharat, a state like Uttar Pradesh, the biggest state of India, a party like the BSP, the Bahujan Samaj Party, that purports to represent the Dalits, the lowest of the lowest, they've been completely wiped out. A party which has been in power several times in the states has been completely wiped out. So the normal, the fissures of language, caste, religion, I think there has been a massive underplaying of those traditional fault lines. And we are seeing a new rhetoric in Indian politics, a rhetoric of growth and good governance.
Thank you very much, Pradyut. We are extremely grateful to you for taking so much time to spend with us. We look forward to another conversation with you, a public conversation, 100 days from now. And of course, in between, we hope we will see you here or in India. We are very grateful for your cooperation on this front. I want to thank my deputy, Bharat Gopalaswamy, who is in India, and I hope will be back with us soon. We need him here, and of course Rajan Menon, who's joined us from New York. I'm sorry I was teleporting him to Philadelphia mistakenly. Rajan, thank you so much for your wisdom and your commentary, and for being a part of the South Asia Center's work.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I thank all the people that have been following us on Google Hangout, and we hope to post this link so that it will be available for people on YouTube, among other things. Thank you all, and on behalf of the Atlantic Council and the South Asia Center and all my colleagues in the center, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.